He bought a secondhand car, thinking it was just an ordinary purchase. But what he found inside changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Watch next to find out what happened afterward, and don't miss our upcoming stories. The morning light filtered weakly through the blinds of Daniel Carter's small rented house on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was one of those early autumn Saturdays when the air carried the scent of dry leaves and gasoline from distant roads. His coffee had already gone cold on the table, and the stack of unpaid bills beside it seemed to have grown overnight. Daniel sat silently, staring at the numbers, feeling the slow, dull ache of another day spent without progress. 3 months had passed since the repair shop where he had worked for over a decade shut down. The owner had gone bankrupt, and the men who had once spent their days elbow-deep in engine grease and laughter now scattered across town, some finding new jobs, others giving up altogether. Daniel had tried to keep himself afloat by doing small repairs in his yard, brake replacements, oil changes, welding a few old frames. But the work came irregularly, and the money was never enough. He had always taken pride in being self-reliant, never the kind of man to ask for help. But as the savings dwindled, the sense of control slipped away like sand through his fingers. The world outside didn't seem to have room for men like him anymore. Steady, methodical, quiet. The repair shop had been his rhythm, his proof of worth, and now even the rumble of engines felt like an echo from another life. That morning, after another rejection email for a job he knew he could do with his eyes closed, he found himself scrolling through online listings for used pickup trucks. The idea had been forming quietly for weeks. If he could buy a reliable vehicle, he could take more mobile jobs, carry tools, perhaps even rebuild small engines in other people's garages. A single good truck could mean independence again. He browsed absently, past dozens of overpriced, overused models, until one particular ad stopped his scrolling. The headline was plain: Ford F-150 2003 needs minor work. Cheap. No paperwork. The price was less than half of what it should have been, and the listing included only a single photo, a shadowy image of a truck parked under a tree, the edges blurred as if taken in haste. The description was just a few lines long and oddly impersonal. Something about the brevity caught his attention. It didn't look like a scam, yet it lacked the salesmanship that came with most ads. It was almost as if the seller didn't care whether anyone called or not. He hesitated, staring at the number. Logic told him to move on. Cheap cars with no paperwork rarely meant anything good. But there was something magnetic in the mystery. Maybe it was the phrasing, maybe the idea of rescuing something neglected, or maybe he just wanted a reason to move again, to feel like he was doing something that mattered. He dialed the number. The voice that answered was rough, hoarse, and older. The man spoke quickly, giving only an address at the edge of town and saying he'd be home all afternoon. Daniel noted the way he said it, flat, emotionless, as if he were eager to be done with the conversation. By noon, the sun was warm enough to shimmer on the asphalt as Daniel drove through quieter streets that gave way to stretches of rural road. He passed small, sagging houses with broken fences, faded mailboxes, and empty yards. The address led him to the far end of a dirt lane lined with wild grass. The property was fenced with rusted wire, and beyond it stood a weather-beaten house that looked forgotten by time. In the yard sat the pickup from the photograph, covered in dust, its blue paint faded to a dull gray. The man who stepped out to meet him looked like he had been carved out of the same rough material as the place itself. His clothes hung loosely from a thin frame, his eyes dark and hollow, his expression worn from years of hardship. "You're here for the truck," he said, not asking but stating it. Daniel nodded, walking toward the vehicle. The closer he came, the more details emerged. Scratches along the driver's side, a dent near the door that looked odd, not from a crash, but as if the metal had bulged outward from within. The tires were old but intact, and the windows had the dull, smudged look of glass that hadn't been cleaned in years. Daniel opened the door. The hinges creaked like something long unused. A faint smell greeted him, not quite unpleasant, but earthy, damp, almost like wet soil after rain. It clung faintly to the fabric seats. He pressed the key the man handed him into the ignition. The engine hesitated, coughed, then turned over with a steady, throaty hum. Not bad for an old truck. Beneath the rumble, though, there was a faint metallic rattle, soft and intermittent. He leaned out of the cab. "Something loose in the back?" he asked automatically, but the man only shrugged, his eyes on the ground. Daniel stepped out, did a quick walk around. There was rust along the underside, sure, and a few paint blisters, but the frame looked solid. It was an honest old workhorse of a truck. He could fix the small things easily enough. The man, meanwhile, stood by the porch, arms folded, watching him with a tense impatience, as though he wanted the deal over before Daniel had even decided. "No returns," he said gruffly when Daniel came back toward him. "You take it. It's yours, as is." His voice cracked slightly, like someone reciting a line they had already said too many times. The price was suspiciously low. Daniel felt a flicker of doubt. Still, he counted out the cash, signed the crude, handwritten bill of sale, and shook the man's hand. The seller's grip was weak and dry, his eyes darting towards the truck as if afraid it might start moving on its own. "You'll be fine with it," he said at last, but the tone didn't match the words. When Daniel climbed in to drive away, he felt the man's gaze on him, lingering, heavy. As he rolled out of the yard, the truck jolted slightly over the uneven ground. Something clanked faintly from the bed behind him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but saw only the tarp covering a few scraps of metal and an old tire. The road, back toward the main highway, twisted between fields, the sound of gravel under the tires oddly rhythmic. The truck handled better than expected, though the smell inside refused to fade, and that faint rattle in the back seemed to grow more distinct whenever he slowed. By the time he reached the city limits, the sun was lowering behind a haze of orange light. His mind wandered between satisfaction and unease. For the first time in months, he felt the thrill of ownership, of possibility, a tool for a new start. But beneath it lay something else. That bulge in the door, the silent, watchful expression of the man who sold it, the smell that clung like damp air from a basement that hadn't been opened in years. He parked the truck in his small driveway and cut the engine. The sudden quiet was startling. For a moment, he sat still, hands on the wheel, listening to the tick of cooling metal. Somewhere within the truck, a soft click echoed, like a piece of loose hardware shifting as the frame settled. He turned the key to off, leaned back, and exhaled slowly. Maybe it was just age and neglect. Machines had a way of carrying traces of the people who used them, smells, wear, even silence. He stepped out, stretched, and ran his hand along the door, feeling the uneven dent beneath the thin coat of paint. The light caught it differently now, revealing the faintest hint of distortion, a ripple frozen in steel. He thought about sanding it down, repainting it tomorrow. The work might do him good. As he locked up and headed toward the house, a small sound came from the truck bed. something shifting under the tarp just once, then stillness. Daniel froze for a second, looking back. The yard was quiet. A light breeze stirred the grass, and the shadows lengthened across the hood of the truck. He waited, but the sound didn't repeat. He told himself it was nothing, just metal settling, maybe a tool rolling. Still, the image of the old man's hollow eyes flashed across his mind, and a strange thought followed. That the man hadn't sold the truck out of greed or need, but out of fear. He turned away at last, shaking it off, and went inside. From the kitchen window, he could still see the shape of the truck, its dull surface reflecting the last line of sunset. It stood silent, waiting, as if it had been meant to end up here all along. The next morning, Daniel woke before the alarm. For a moment, he lay there in the half-light, listening to the hum of silence in the house, his mind already circling back to the truck in the driveway. It was strange how the thought of that old Ford filled him with both purpose and unease. A used vehicle was nothing new to him. He had repaired hundreds over the years, seen every sort of mechanical failure, from corroded fuel lines to cracked blocks. But this one lingered differently in his mind, as if the metal itself had absorbed a memory it refused to release. He pushed the thought aside, threw on a faded t-shirt and work pants, and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and smelled faintly of wet grass. Dew shimmered on the hood of the truck. It looked almost respectable now under the daylight, just another aging workhorse waiting for a second chance. Daniel circled it slowly, noting details he'd missed yesterday. The uneven spray of the paint on the door where the dent was, faint scratches around the rear handle, the way one of the taillights had been replaced with a newer, mismatched part. None of it unusual, and yet, together, the details seemed inconsistent, as if different hands had worked on it at different times, each with their own intent. He climbed in and started the engine. It turned over smoothly, but as soon as the cabin filled with air from the vents, he caught that smell again. Stronger now, distinct and unmistakable. It wasn't oil, or mildew, or exhaust. It was heavier, more organic, like damp soil mixed with rust. He turned off the fan and rolled down the window, letting the crisp air replace the scent. It faded, but didn't disappear. The smell seemed to come not from any single source, but from the truck itself, as though it had seeped into the very fabric of the seats. He backed it up toward the garage and gathered his cleaning supplies: buckets, rags, degreaser, polish, gloves. The day stretched before him, bright and silent, the kind of day meant for honest labor. He started with the exterior, washing away the layers of dust and road grime until the faded paint began to show a hint of its original color. As he worked, the smell seemed to rise again, not from outside, but from within. When he opened the driver's door and knelt to vacuum the floor mats, the odor hit him like a wave. It was sharp, almost metallic, laced with something earthy. Daniel frowned and peeled back the old rubber mat. Beneath it, the carpet was discolored, a mottled, dark patch spreading from the edge of the seat toward the pedals. He rubbed it with a gloved finger, expecting dirt, but the texture was different. Stiff, almost glossy in places. The kind of residue that came from something spilled long ago and never cleaned properly. He sprayed degreaser, scrubbed, but the mark barely changed. The smell grew stronger, rising from the damp fibers. He sat back on his heels, breathing through his mouth. Maybe it was just mold from years of neglect. He could replace the carpet easily enough. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. He leaned closer, sniffing the air, and caught the unmistakable undertone of iron. It reminded him of the scent that clung to his hands after hours of grinding brake rotors, metal, and something faintly organic, like rust mingled with blood. He felt a shiver and told himself it was imagination. Moving to the back seat, he noticed the bolts holding the bench looked freshly turned. The heads of the screws were cleaner than the surrounding metal, as if someone had recently removed them. He crouched, loosening them one by one. When he lifted the cushion slightly, he saw crumbs of dry dirt and flakes of rust underneath. The smell that escaped made his stomach tighten. It was the same earthy, metallic odor, stronger now. He fetched a flashlight and shone it into the narrow space. Something glinted faintly in the shadows, like the edge of metal embedded in grime. He reached in with his gloved hand, but the object wouldn't budge. He tugged, scraped his knuckles, cursed under his breath. Finally, he gave up, deciding to remove the entire seat later when he had the right tools. For now, he noted its position carefully, the way it seemed almost wedged into the frame. By midday, sweat darkened his shirt and the truck gleamed dully in the sunlight. From the outside it looked renewed, but the interior felt heavier than before. He wiped his face with a rag, staring at the dented door. The deformity caught the light oddly, revealing faint patterns beneath the paint. He frowned, took a scraper, and gently peeled a small section of the outer layer. The top coat flaked away easily, revealing an older, darker paint beneath, and under that, faint indentations. Letters. He leaned closer. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he traced the grooves with his fingertips, the shape of each mark became undeniable. The letters had been pressed from inside out, distorting the metal. His stomach tightened. The word was fragmented, incomplete, but clear enough. Help. The rest was obscured by corrosion and layers of paint. He stepped back slowly, heart beating faster. It could mean anything, he told himself. Some bored worker, a prank, graffiti made long before the door was replaced. But the indentations were too crude, too desperate. They weren't carved. They were forced. Someone had struck the inside panel with something heavy, again and again, until the letters appeared. Daniel straightened, looked toward the house across the street as if for reassurance. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the distant whine of a leaf blower. He felt the sudden absurdity of standing there, staring at a dent in his own door like it might whisper back. He shook his head, forced a laugh, and decided to leave the rest of the paint untouched. It was nothing, he told himself, nothing more than the remnants of an old accident. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. Inside, over a late lunch, he found himself glancing through the window every few minutes, the truck visible between the slats of the blinds. The metallic gleam of the door seemed to follow him. The letters, if that's what they were, felt like a message half buried under time, something not meant to be uncovered. By evening, the air cooled, and the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. Daniel sat in his garage, tools spread around him, flipping through his notebook. Old habits guided him, documenting everything, noting the condition of each part, planning replacements. Yet his mind wasn't on the work. He kept circling back to the smell, the dent, the odd silence of the cellar. The man's eyes had looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. He'd spoken too quickly, too practiced. When Daniel closed the notebook, he realized the smell had drifted into the garage. It was faint, but present, even with the doors open. He walked to the truck, sniffed near the seams of the cabin. It was strongest near the back seat, the same spot where he'd seen the glint of metal. He turned on the flashlight again and crouched. The small space seemed darker now, deeper somehow, as though it receded into shadow. He tapped the seat, listening. A hollow sound answered, a cavity beneath the cushion, Maybe a storage compartment he hadn't known about. He stood for a long moment, debating whether to keep going. The rational part of him argued it was probably just a minor repair issue, a hidden storage bin, maybe even a rusted section that trapped moisture. But the smell, God, that smell was wrong. It wasn't the ordinary rot of neglect. It was old, heavy, and patient. He decided to stop for the night. He pulled the tarp halfway over the truck, turned off the garage light, and stepped outside. The sun was gone, leaving a faint crimson band over the horizon. From somewhere nearby came the muffled sound of a dog barking, then the whir of a passing car. Daniel locked the side door and headed inside, but as he reached the steps, a gust of wind carried the scent again. Metal and damp earth, faint but clear, as if the truck had exhaled. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake, replaying the day in his mind. The paint peeling away in curls. The word pressed into the door. The smell that clung to his hands even after he had washed them twice. He imagined the sound of something shifting under the back seat, the faint rattle he had heard on the drive home. At some point past midnight, he rose and looked out through the blinds. The truck was a dark silhouette under the streetlight, motionless, innocent, as if waiting for him. He almost laughed at himself for the paranoia, but then he noticed something that froze him in place. The tarp he had pulled halfway across the truck bed earlier now hung differently, tightened, as though it had been adjusted. He stared for a long time, breath shallow, trying to convince himself he had simply remembered it wrong. After several minutes, he backed away from the window, his heart still drumming. He sat on the edge of the bed until dawn began to thin the shadows. When the light finally broke, he told himself he would check it again in the morning, calmly, with clear eyes. There had to be an explanation. He would take his tools, remove the back seat properly, and find whatever caused that smell. Maybe there was a leak, or a dead animal caught somewhere deep in the structure. That was all. But deep down, even before the first light fully reached the truck outside, Daniel already knew this wasn't going to be a normal repair. There was something in that vehicle that had outlasted time, hidden beneath the metal, silent but alive in memory. Something that wanted to be found. Morning light spilled weakly across the narrow driveway, catching in the streaks of grime on the truck's windshield. Daniel stood beside it, sipping bitter coffee that had already cooled, feeling the weight of another restless night pressing behind his eyes. He had barely slept. His dreams, if they could be called that, had been nothing but endless loops of the word pressed into the door, the smell clinging to his hands and the faint creak of the tarp shifting in the dark. He'd tried to convince himself that exhaustion was turning small things into shadows of bigger ones, but now, standing in front of the Ford in the sober light of day, that felt like a lie. The unease hadn't dissolved with morning. It had settled deeper, like rust spreading under a clean coat of paint. He opened the garage door and rolled up his sleeves. The plan was simple, practical, mechanical. Remove the back seat, find the source of the smell, clean it out, and move on. He gathered his tools in silence, each metallic click echoing in the stillness. As he worked the bolts loose, the smell that had haunted him thickened, rising from the seams like something awakening. It wasn't overpowering yet, but dense and earthy, impossible to ignore. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, more from nerves than heat. When the final bolt gave way, he gripped the seat with both hands and pulled. For a moment, it resisted, clinging to the floor like it didn't want to be moved. Then it lifted with a dull metallic groan, revealing a cavity underneath. Dust swirled up, thick and gray, carrying that unmistakable scent of soil and age. Daniel aimed the flashlight into the gap. The beam landed on a small metal box, tarnished and scratched, no larger than a shoebox, wedged between the floor panels. It looked old, deliberately placed there. His pulse quickened. He hesitated, listening to the soft hum of the idling world outside, the distant bark of a dog, the faint hiss of wind through leaves, then reached in and lifted the box free. It was heavier than it looked. The surface was cold to the touch, the latch stiff with corrosion. He set it on the workbench and pried it open carefully with a screwdriver. The hinges creaked, flakes of rust breaking away. Inside, wrapped in a brittle plastic sheet, lay a bundle of papers, yellowed with time. Beneath them was a small notebook bound in cracked leather, its edges darkened by moisture. For a long moment, Daniel simply stared, reluctant to disturb the strange stillness that had settled over the garage. Finally, he peeled back the plastic and began to unfold the papers. They weren't official documents. No titles or stamps, just pages of handwriting, hurried and uneven. The ink had bled in places, words blurred beyond recognition. But between the smears, he could make out fragments, route numbers, dates, names of towns, and occasional symbols, triangles, circles, arrows. It looked like a driver's notes, maybe a log of deliveries, but written with an odd, almost frantic hand. He opened the notebook next. The pages were filled with scrawled text and crude sketches. Some showed maps, others strings of symbols like something out of a code book. On one page, near the middle, a single sentence stood out in darker ink, written with such pressure that the pen had torn the paper. They said it's just waste, but waste doesn't bleed. Daniel's hand froze. He reread the words several times, feeling a chill settle in his chest. He turned more pages, searching for context, but the entries grew more chaotic, the handwriting barely legible toward the end. At the bottom of the box, half hidden under the papers, lay another object, a set of car keys. They were older, heavier than modern ones, the metal dulled with time. Attached to the ring was a worn plastic tag bearing a partial engraving, L. Ferg, before the rest of the name was worn away. Daniel turned it over in his palm. The keys didn't match his truck. He looked from the keys to the notebook, then back to the empty cavity under the back seat. Why would someone hide this? And if these notes belonged to the previous owner, what had happened to him? The smell, the word pressed into the metal, it all pointed to something beyond mechanical mystery. Still, his mind clung to reason. Perhaps the man had been paranoid, maybe even unwell. Truckers spent long hours on the road. Loneliness did strange things to people. Yet, even as he tried to rationalize it, the facts refused to settle into comfort. The latch on the box hadn't rusted shut from age alone. It had been sealed deliberately, and the keys, though scratched and faded, were clean compared to everything else inside, as if they had been used more recently than the other items. He wiped them with a rag, turning them under the light. His phone buzzed suddenly, making him start. The number was unfamiliar, local area code. He answered, half expecting a client. There was only static for a moment, then the faint click of a line disconnecting. He stared at the screen, a vague unease tightening in his chest. Coincidence, he told himself, and set the phone aside. He needed more information. He went inside, opened his laptop, and began to search the VIN number of his truck online. Free databases gave little, just basic details, but one paid report revealed something that made him lean closer. The vehicle had indeed been registered to a man named Lucas Ferguson in 2013. Last recorded status: salvage, disposed after incident investigation. Under comments, a single line read, "Unit involved in containment case. Do not reissue title." Daniel's mouth went dry. He read it twice, then a third time. Containment case. The phrase felt out of place, bureaucratic and ominous. He searched the name Lucas Ferguson next. It didn't take long before a headline appeared from an archived local news site dated 8 years earlier. Truck driver missing after late-night delivery. The short article described how Ferguson, an independent hauler, had vanished after transporting construction debris and scrap for a private client. His truck had later been found abandoned near a wooded area outside town. Inside, police reported unexplained biological traces. The investigation had gone nowhere. The case was closed without charges. Daniel leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The words blurred for a moment as he tried to process them. His gaze drifted toward the garage, where the old truck sat in the sunlight like a patient animal waiting to be fed. It couldn't be the same vehicle. There had to be hundreds of similar models, same color, same year. But the VIN matched perfectly. He retrieved the photo he'd found earlier under the seat. A printed image of the truck half hidden among trees, the front cab wedged against the base of a massive oak. He studied it closely now, holding it near the window. The angle was strange, as if taken hurriedly from the side. The bark of the tree seemed to have grown around part of the fender, consuming it. Moss covered the hood. In the background, barely visible, was the outline of a small farmhouse, its porch sagging. The house looked familiar. He had seen it once before, under a different light, with an old man standing outside. His stomach turned as recognition settled in. It was the same house where he had bought the truck. Daniel's pulse quickened. He fetched the small map app on his phone, entering the coordinates embedded in the digital metadata of the photo, something he knew how to access from his years of tinkering with electronics. The app pinpointed the location on the outskirts of town, near a patch of forest that bordered a closed dumping site. The very area where, according to the article, the missing truck had been found. He sat frozen, the screen glowing cold in his hand. The old man who sold him the truck, had he been related to Ferguson? A brother, perhaps, or someone trying to get rid of evidence tied to that night? The thought felt too direct, too damning, and yet every thread pulled tautly in that direction. As evening crept in, Daniel went back to the garage, drawn by a pull he couldn't explain. The smell lingered faintly, even after hours with the doors open. He knelt beside the open cavity where the box had been, shining the flashlight along the seams. Something glittered faintly deep within the crack of the metal floor. He angled the beam closer. It was a small fragment of glass, embedded like a splinter, catching the light in a dull reflection. He plucked it free carefully and held it up. It was part of a broken lens, maybe from a camera. He felt a cold realization slide over him. Someone had documented whatever had happened here. The photo, the fragments, the sealed box, all of it pointed to someone trying to preserve a truth, not erase it. But why hide it in a car destined for destruction? The smell thickened as he crouched there, heavy enough to make him gag. It was coming from beneath the metal panels now, seeping upward through the seams. He backed away, wiping his mouth, and shut the door, trying to trap the scent inside. His hands were trembling. He needed air. Outside, the sky had gone pale gray, the kind of color that blurs the horizon. Daniel sat on the porch steps, the wind brushing across his face. He replayed every word the old man had said, every look, every silence. The man had been desperate to be rid of the truck, had refused questions, had said, "No returns." That phrase now felt less like a transaction warning and more like a plea. He reached for his phone again, dialing the number from the bill of sale. The call went straight to a recorded message. The number was no longer in service. He tried again. Same result. The unease in his stomach hardened into resolve. He couldn't leave it there, not with half an answer buried in metal and rot. Back inside, he carefully laid out everything from the box on the table. The notebook, the papers, the keys, the photograph. Each item seemed to belong to a timeline of something lost, fragments of a life that had ended without closure. The handwriting in the notebook looked increasingly unsteady toward the last pages, the lines uneven. On the final page, a single sentence stood alone, scrawled across the bottom margin. "If anyone finds this, the truck is not empty." Daniel stared at it until the words blurred again, the edges swimming in his vision. The chill in his chest deepened into something like dread. He looked toward the garage, where the shape of the Ford loomed through the open doorway half in shadow. He knew what he had to do next. He would go to that house again. He would find out who the old man really was and what the truck had carried all those years ago. He didn't yet understand why, but something in him felt tethered to the story now, like a mechanic to a stubborn engine that refused to start. Some things, once uncovered, wouldn't let go until you followed them to the end. The sun had nearly set when he locked the garage and went back inside. The smell still lingered faintly on his clothes, a mix of earth, oil, and something darker, something that no cleaning product could erase. He didn't know it yet, but the line between his curiosity and his safety had already begun to blur. The past was awake now, and it was waiting. Daniel left at sunrise. He hadn't slept, not properly. The hours between midnight and dawn had passed in a haze of images and fragmented thoughts. Glimpses of the tree with metal buried in its bark, the phrase in the notebook, the look in the old man's eyes. There was no longer any room for doubt. This wasn't just a forgotten truck with a bad smell and strange dents. It was the fragment of a larger story, a piece of something that had tried to stay buried. He packed his bag quietly, took a camera, a flashlight, gloves, and a crowbar. He had no specific plan, but instinct told him not to go empty-handed. Before leaving, he glanced back at the truck in the garage, half covered under a tarp that now looked more like a shroud than protection. The smell had faded with the night air, but he didn't kid himself. It would come back. The address he had used to buy the truck was still marked in the GPS history. It took less than an hour to reach it again, winding through roads that grew narrower and more cracked with every mile. The sun hung low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields and sagging fences. When he turned onto the dirt lane, he recognized the place immediately, though it looked different this time, emptier somehow. The windows of the old house were now boarded up with plywood, nailed hastily, as if in fear rather than for protection. The weeds had grown taller in just a week, choking the front walk and overtaking the gravel drive. He parked at the edge of the property and stepped out, his boots crunching over twigs and dry earth. There was no sign of life. No parked car, no barking dog, no birds even. Daniel approached the porch slowly, noting how the boards groaned under his weight. A pile of unopened mail had accumulated near the door, flyers, a newspaper, and a single envelope with no return address. He knocked out of habit, though he knew no one would answer. The house gave nothing back. No sound inside, no movement, only the creak of the wind passing through a gap in the siding. He turned away from the door and walked around the house, eyes scanning for anything. Motion, footprints, clues. At the back, the property dropped into a wooded slope. And there, almost hidden behind a row of leaning fence posts, he saw it. The edge of a path. Faint, overgrown, but still visible. It wasn't a walking trail, but a sunken line in the grass that could only be made by tires or heavy boots compressed repeatedly over time. He followed it. The woods swallowed sound. Within a few steps, the outside world seemed to dissolve. The path narrowed as the trees grew denser, their branches clawing low across the way, forcing him to duck and step carefully. Every now and then he saw old trash, bottles, a tire, the remains of a tarp disintegrated into threads, and he realized this wasn't a recreational space. It was a place people came to dump things they wanted forgotten. The air grew heavier, still. The smell of rot and earth mixed with mildew. He moved carefully, each step deliberate as the trail curved toward a deeper shadow. And then he saw it. The tree. It rose from the forest floor like a monument, broad and ancient, with thick, gnarled roots crawling across the ground. Its bark was coarse and split, and wedged into its side, half consumed by time and growth, were pieces of metal. Rusted, unrecognizable at first, but unmistakably man-made. A strip of chrome, a crushed mirror, the corner of a tail light. And embedded deepest of all, the edge of a front fender, blue, scratched, and bearing the faint ghost of numbers Daniel had already memorized. His knees weakened. It was the same truck, the very same one that now sat in his garage. Yet this wasn't a photo. It was here, and it hadn't been moved. For a long moment, he could only stare. The photo he had found had shown the truck here, buried in the roots, but the vehicle he had bought was whole, running, clean enough to be resold. This didn't make sense. He stepped closer, inspecting the fender. It was fused into the tree like a bone healed wrong. Nature had tried to erase it, to consume it, but the shape was still visible. The VIN panel had rusted, but when he wiped it with a cloth, he could make out just enough. It was a match. So what the hell had he bought? He walked in slow circles around the base of the tree, his breath shallow. There were signs of past disturbance, ash in the soil, charred fragments, the brittle corner of a melted dashboard knob. Someone had tried to burn the truck here, maybe even succeeded, and yet it now stood whole in his garage. He crouched and sifted through the ash with his gloved hands. A few scraps of paper disintegrated between his fingers. Then, deeper, he found something more solid. A key. It was half melted, the plastic warped and blackened, but the metal teeth were intact. It looked like a truck key. Not new, not old, contemporary with what should have belonged to Ferguson's vehicle. He turned it over. There were faint markings on the head, the faded impression of a manufacturer's logo, the kind used by Ford in early 2000s models. His breath caught. It had been here, the truck, burned, left, consumed by the forest. And yet, somehow, his truck still existed. He stood abruptly, dizziness sweeping over him. The air felt thinner. Nothing about this was right. If the truck had burned here, what was sitting in his driveway? A clone? A rebuilt copy? The logic unraveled too quickly, too violently. He needed answers. He turned and retraced his steps up the path, moving faster now, ducking through branches and swatting away the vines that reached for his arms. The sky had darkened slightly, though the sun was still above. The pressure in the air felt different. Something was shifting. Back at the edge of the property, he paused to catch his breath. The house stood as still as before, yet somehow more menacing now, its boarded windows like blind eyes watching him. He looked toward the old shed near the fence, a slanted structure he hadn't noticed on his first visit. Its door hung crooked, slightly ajar. Something about it pulled at him, a whisper of instinct that said if there were any answers left here, they were inside. He approached slowly, each step stirring dry leaves. The door creaked as he nudged it open, revealing darkness within. He clicked on his flashlight. Dust danced in the beam like ash. Inside were old tools hanging from rusted nails, stacks of rotting wood, the skeleton of a lawnmower. But near the back, against the far wall, sat another metal box. This one was larger than the one he had found in the truck and covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. He stepped around a collapsed work table and approached it carefully. The smell reached him before he touched it, strong, foul, the unmistakable stench of rot that clung to the back of the throat. He gagged, covering his mouth, but forced himself closer. He reached for the latch. It creaked as he pulled it up, the metal cold and gritty beneath his fingers. The lid opened slowly. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, scattered and curled, their edges browned with age. He reached in and lifted the top few. They weren't snapshots, they were portraits, almost clinical in composition. Faces, people, some smiling, some not, all standing near the same blue truck. Lucas Ferguson was in several of them. Younger, bearded, often standing near the cab of the truck with a clipboard or tool in hand. But in others, ones deeper in the stack, the expressions changed. The people looked different, stiff, afraid. In one photo, a woman stood beside the truck, her face pale, eyes wide, as if caught mid-sentence. In another, a man crouched near the rear tire, his gaze off frame, brow furrowed, and then the final photo. Daniel's hands froze as he lifted it. It was darker than the others, grainy, poorly lit. The truck again. The same blue Ford, the trunk open. Inside, barely visible, was a shape, a silhouette. Human. The body curled inward like something discarded. He dropped the photo. His breath came fast, shallow. The smell rose up from the box like a physical force now, thick and oily, pushing against him. He staggered back, hitting the work table, sending a rusted wrench clattering to the floor. That was when he heard it. Footsteps. Outside. He killed the flashlight instantly, heart pounding in his ears. The door creaked again. A shadow fell across the floor. Then a voice, dry and cracked. "You shouldn't have come back." Daniel's blood went cold. The voice was familiar, aged, rough, unmistakable. He turned slowly. The old man stood in the doorway, the same one who had sold him the truck. But his expression had changed. No longer tired or vacant, but tense, eyes wild, face twisted with something between fear and fury. Daniel said nothing. The man stepped further in, letting the door close behind him with a soft thud. "You were supposed to take it," the man said, voice rising. "That was a deal. You take it, and it leaves me alone." Daniel's throat was dry. "What is it?" he managed. "What happened to the people in those photos?" The old man's face tightened. "They tried to do what you're doing. Dig. Uncover. But you can't. You don't understand. The truck, it doesn't forget. It doesn't let go." Daniel backed away instinctively, hand brushing against the crowbar on the bench behind him. "I needed someone to take it," the man whispered. "Someone who didn't know. Someone clean." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind against the side of the shed. Daniel gripped the crowbar. "I'm not going to end up like them," he said. The man's eyes gleamed. "You already have." The next moment passed in a blur. Daniel lunging for the door, the man reaching, fingers scraping against his sleeve. He pushed past him, stumbling into the light, sprinting across the yard. Behind him, the man shouted something, but he didn't hear it. He ran to his car, started it with shaking hands, and tore away from the house, gravel spraying beneath his tires. In the rearview mirror, the house shrank, then vanished behind the trees. But even as he drove, heart racing, the photographs burned into his memory. The people, the truck, the final image in the trunk, and the smell. No matter how far he drove, it stayed with him. Embedded in the fibers of his clothes, in the corners of his mind, in the silence between each heartbeat. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and now he was part of it. Daniel didn't stop driving until the city lights blurred past the edges of his windshield and the shed, the old man, and the twisted shadows of the woods were far behind him. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the crowbar thrown into the passenger footwell like a weapon he hadn't known he'd need. He was breathing too fast, every breath shallow, the air in the car tight and tainted. Even with the windows cracked, the stench clung to him. The rot of that box, the sharpness of rusted metal, and something more elusive, more human. He kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting headlights to appear, or worse, to see the man's gaunt figure emerging from the shadows of the back seat. But the road remained empty. By the time he reached his driveway, the sun had begun to fall low again, casting long orange shafts of light across the rooftops and treetops. The garage door groaned open. His Ford sat inside, unmoved, quiet, the tarp still draped across the back like a half-closed eye. For a moment, he simply sat in the car, unwilling to get out, unsure what the next step was. But deep down, he knew what he needed to do. He took the box of photographs he'd grabbed from the shed, the melted key, and the flash drive he had found earlier from the truck. Inside, he spread everything out on his kitchen table. The documents were brittle, faded with time, but as he organized them, the story began to take shape. They weren't just random notes and scraps. This was a ledger, a map, a timeline. Ferguson hadn't been an ordinary hauler. His delivery routes were marked with inconsistencies, double entries, and detours through areas that didn't make sense for simple scrap metal or construction debris. Many of the documents referred to alternative containment, and some included unfamiliar acronyms. Others bore stamped initials from a contracting company Daniel didn't recognize. One folded page caught his attention. It was a copy of a shipping manifest labeled in block letters, "Yoon Scheduled Material Transfer, Priority Handling." No logo, no header. Just a series of numerical codes and a destination point. An old industrial site on the edge of the county, long since closed. The manifest had been signed. Lucas Ferguson. The same name he had now seen on the truck key, in the VIN registry, and in the background of the photographs. Beneath that document, Daniel uncovered a thinner envelope marked with a smudged red stamp. Witness hold, do not release. Inside was a photocopy of what looked like a handwritten report. The name on top wasn't Ferguson, it was someone else. A man named Robert L. Hayes. In the statement, Hayes described working as a night security contractor at a decommissioned scrapyard facility. The letter was fragmented, the photocopy poor, but the legible lines told of unusual deliveries arriving in the early morning hours. Trucks with sealed containers. No one was allowed near them. He mentioned Ferguson by name. Daniel stared at the statement, realizing what it meant. Ferguson had been a part of something bigger. He hadn't just disappeared, he had been silenced or vanished because of what he'd seen or what he'd carried. These papers were never supposed to be found. That much was clear. They had been hidden with care, kept out of sight, buried beneath rust and steel. And yet, now they sat on his table, exposed. He went to the garage and returned with the leather notebook, flipping again through the frantic entries and chaotic scribbles. One page now made more sense. A sketch of a layout, possibly the interior of a truck bed, marked with boxes and what appeared to be reinforcement notes. And there, scribbled in the margins, if they find this, they'll find the others. Hide the core, hide it deep. Others. Daniel felt a sudden tightness in his throat. The Ford in his garage was one of many. Ferguson had driven others, maybe dozens, and if each one carried something, someone, if each one had been used for whatever that containment meant, then the truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a vessel, a piece of a chain. And Daniel had broken it by digging. He opened his laptop and began typing. He searched the company name that appeared on several of the forged manifests, CNC Transport Logistics. The results were limited. A faded company listing, no website, no contact information. When he cross-referenced the names in the documents with public records, most returned nothing. Dead ends. Either aliases or people who had gone missing long before he'd found the truck. But one name did bring something back. Robert L. Hayes. A death notice. Dated 6 years prior. No cause of death listed. Cremation requested. No next of kin. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The pattern was sickeningly clear. Anyone connected to this operation had disappeared, quietly and permanently. His own face, reflected in the darkened window of the room, looked older suddenly, thinner. He hadn't even realized how little he'd eaten, how much time he'd lost since bringing that truck home. The sudden ring of his phone shattered the stillness. It vibrated across the table, knocking the photograph to the floor. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. There was no greeting, just breathing. Then a click. A recorded message, distorted and low, barely audible. You've gone too far. Then the line died. Daniel stared at the screen as the call ended. His skin crawled. Someone had found his number. Someone knew what he had. He stood, locking the doors and pulling the curtains closed. The house, once small and familiar, now felt vulnerable, exposed. He couldn't stay here. Not with the documents, not with the truck. He packed everything, the photos, the notebook, the manifest, the melted key, into a backpack. The flash drive he copied onto 2 others and hid them in separate drawers. He kept one on him. The decision was immediate. He had to get this to someone. Not the police. They would bury it, or worse, become part of the silence. He thought of a man he knew through a mutual acquaintance, a freelance journalist named Darren Fields. They had met only once, months ago, at a bar where Daniel had replaced a leaky water heater. Darren had spoken about working on corporate stories, whistleblower stuff. At the time, Daniel had barely listened. Now, the man's number was the only one he could think of. He called. Darren answered on the second ring, groggy, but as soon as Daniel mentioned the documents, the photos, and the possibility of an active cover-up, Darren's tone changed. They agreed to meet at a diner 20 miles outside the city, somewhere quiet. Daniel arrived before sundown. The diner was empty except for a waitress and a man at the counter nursing coffee. Darren showed up minutes later, tall, pale, with the tired eyes of someone used to chasing stories people didn't want told. Daniel handed him the folder without a word. The silence stretched as Darren read through it. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightened. He turned the pages slowly, methodically. When he looked up, his face had changed. "This is real," he said. "I didn't make any of it," Daniel replied. "I just found it, or maybe it found me." Darren nodded slowly, flipping back to the manifest. "These people. If this is what it looks like, it's big, deep." Daniel leaned forward. "They're watching. They called me." Darren's expression darkened. "Then we don't have much time." They made a plan. Darren would scan and encrypt the documents, store copies off-site. Daniel would lay low, avoid going back to the house or the truck unless absolutely necessary. If something happened to either of them, the files would be sent to every major media outlet in the country. They parted without a handshake. Paranoia had already infected them both. That night, Daniel stayed in a motel an hour away from home, paid in cash, left no name. He checked his phone twice an hour, watched the security feed he had recently installed on the garage remotely. Everything remained still. But the smell returned. Even there, in a room that had never known the truck, the scent found him. It clung to his jacket, his hands, his memory. Earth, metal, and the faint sweetness of rot. He dreamed of the photographs. In the dreams, the people turned slowly to face him, their mouths open as if trying to speak. But no sound came. Only the wind through the trees and the creaking of a shed door. He awoke at dawn with sweat on his skin and the image of the open trunk burning in his mind. The truck had not been emptied, and the story was not yet told. The day broke gray and windless. Daniel sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the television that he hadn't turned on all night. He'd barely slept, not because of the cheap mattress or the humming ice machine outside the door, but because the air in the room carried the memory of the truck. It wasn't logical, but it was undeniable. The smell was no longer just a scent. It was a presence, an echo following him from place to place, clinging to his skin and the back of his throat like smoke from a fire he couldn't see. He had scrubbed his hands raw in the motel bathroom, but the smell didn't leave. It was a phantom now, alive only in his senses, but real enough to wake him with a start every time his eyes drifted shut. He checked the footage from the garage again. The security camera, mounted in the corner of the ceiling, fed a clean static-free stream to his phone. The truck sat exactly as he'd left it, untouched, the tarp unmoved. The timestamp rolled forward uninterrupted. No shadows passed, no doors opened. Still, Daniel didn't believe the camera, not entirely. Things had already slipped beyond the realm of explanation. He dressed without looking in the mirror and left the motel, using a side exit and paying in cash at the front desk. He drove in long loops, doubling back through residential streets and service roads, checking every turn for a tail. He had never done this before, never had reason to watch for surveillance, but something instinctive had settled in him now, a deep, mechanical sense of self-preservation, the same gut-level awareness that told a man when a jack was about to fail under a car. By the time he made it back to his own neighborhood, the sky had darkened with rolling clouds, and a storm teased the horizon. He didn't pull into his driveway. He passed his house once, slowly, then again from the opposite direction, scanning for anything out of place. There were no new cars parked along the curb, no unfamiliar vans, no men in black sedans. But he noticed something small and wrong. The garbage can, which he hadn't taken to the curb in 3 days, was now empty and turned sideways, as if someone had handled it. The motion sensor porch light blinked erratically, flashing in rhythm as he approached. A malfunction, maybe, or maybe not. He pulled into the garage and shut the door before stepping out of the vehicle. The air inside was stale and close. He waited for a minute, listening to the faint clicks of the cooling engine, then slowly approached the truck. It hadn't moved. The tires rested in the same small oil-stained patches. The tarp was undisturbed, but as he walked around to the passenger side, he saw a footprint in the dust. Just one. Deep, wide, the tread unfamiliar. It hadn't been there before. He stood over it in silence. He didn't need more confirmation. Someone had been inside. He checked the camera feed again. No sign of entry. No glitch. But they had gotten in. That much was clear. He opened the truck door slowly, half expecting the smell to pour out like gas from a ruptured tank. But the interior was clean. Still, unnaturally so. The scent was weaker now, almost as if it had retreated, as though whatever had been left behind had sensed it was no longer alone. He reached under the seat to check the compartment where the box had once been. Empty. No disturbance, but the dust looked brushed, as though a gloved hand had passed through. He checked the dashboard next. The glove compartment had been opened and closed again. Nothing missing, because nothing had been there. But someone had checked. Someone who had reason to suspect what he knew. Someone looking for what he might not even realize he possessed. Daniel stepped away from the truck and locked the garage. Back inside, he went through his backpack, checking the documents. They were still there. But the flash drive, the one he had kept on him, was missing. He swore under his breath and immediately pulled out the duplicates, checking that they were still intact. 2 copies remained, hidden but vulnerable. He packed them into 2 separate envelopes, one addressed to Darren, the other to a post office box he had opened that morning under a false name. He couldn't take any more chances. Whatever this was, whatever web he'd stepped into, it didn't forgive mistakes. It didn't give second warnings. He returned to the garage just as the rain began to fall. Fat drops hit the metal roof in slow, steady rhythms. He stared at the truck. It looked harmless again. Just a tool, a shape of rust and paint and rubber, but he knew better now. The truck was bait, a container, and someone, some entity behind all this, had decided it was time to reel the line back in. He called Darren, voice low. The journalist picked up instantly. "They've been here," Daniel said. Darren's breath caught on the other end. "You okay?" "They didn't take anything, but they wanted me to know they could." "I've started writing," Darren said, "drafting everything, archiving daily. If they touch either of us, it goes out." Daniel felt a grim relief at that, but also a deeper sense of dread. The story wasn't safe just because it was documented. They had the resources to make things disappear. People. Files. Truth. He hung up and sat at his workbench, staring at the wall. Old tools hung in neat rows, covered in a fine layer of dust that had settled during the days he'd been gone. His life used to be simple, manageable. Fix the broken, replace the worn. Now he sat with a crowbar at his feet and a truck full of ghosts behind him. A knock came at the door, not loud but firm. He froze. No one came here without calling first. No one knocked like that. He rose silently, stepped to the front window, and peered through the edge of the curtain. A man stood on the porch. Average build, black baseball cap, jacket zipped to the throat, hands in pockets. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't a client. Daniel's chest tightened. The man knocked again. Daniel didn't move. After a moment, the man stepped back, looked up at the camera mounted over the garage, then turned and walked back down the driveway. He didn't hurry. He didn't look around. He just walked to a black SUV parked 2 houses down, and drove away. Daniel didn't breathe again until the taillights vanished. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark with a wrench in one hand and the crowbar in the other, listening for footsteps that never came. The storm passed, leaving the house damp and heavy with silence. And in that silence, Daniel knew something had shifted. The line had been crossed. They weren't just watching now. They were probing, testing, reminding him that whatever truth he held was borrowed time. At dawn, he packed the flash drive and drove to a library across town. He used a public computer to upload the files to a secure server Darren had given him access to. Then he made another backup and mailed it to an out-of-state contact, a friend of a friend, someone who owed him nothing and would ask no questions. By the time he returned home, exhaustion had sunk deep into his bones, but there was no room left for rest. He couldn't stop. He had to stay ahead of whatever force was closing in. That afternoon, he found the flyer in his mailbox. It looked like an advertisement at first, a generic printout for a security company, but on the back, someone had written a single word in Sharpie. Enough. No name, no number, no demand, just the word. Daniel stood in the driveway, the paper fluttering in his hand, the smell of rain still in the air. He knew what it meant. He knew what came next. They wouldn't warn him again. The following morning brought with it a peculiar calm, the kind of stillness that didn't promise peace, but rather a momentary lull before the world unraveled. Daniel stood barefoot in his kitchen, staring through the small pane of glass above the sink. The neighborhood looked untouched by the night's storm. Lawns washed clean, leaves sticking to the pavement, and the occasional curtain pulled aside as early risers moved through their morning rituals. But for him, normalcy was no longer reachable. Not after the knock, not after the message, and certainly not after the realization that there were eyes on him now, eyes that didn't blink. He poured coffee he wouldn't drink and stood there, motionless, as the liquid cooled beside him. Something had shifted in the air. The warning had been simple and final. Enough. That word had less to do with what they wanted and more with what they were willing to do. It was the kind of message sent by people who had delivered it many times before, and who rarely had to deliver it twice. By mid-morning, Daniel had loaded the last of the documents into a small fireproof lockbox. He tucked it beneath the back seat of a different car, a borrowed vehicle from a friend whose name had never once come up in any public database Daniel had searched. He wasn't running, at least not yet. He was relocating the pieces, spreading them apart, removing the center from the story so that if they came to crush it, all they would find was hollow metal and silence. The truck sat quietly in the garage, its tires resting in perfect oil-darkened prints, unmoved from where it had last been parked. The tarp had been stripped away, folded and set aside like a blanket from a deathbed. He had made the decision hours before the sun rose. He wouldn't leave it here for them. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of reclaiming it, of brushing it clean and selling it again to some other unsuspecting man desperate enough to take it in. He would take it somewhere no one would go. Somewhere it wouldn't come back. He drove without music, without a destination, the wheel under his hands vibrating with that same low hum he had once ignored, the one he had chalked up to age and wear. But now, each vibration felt more like breath, like the truck was still alive beneath him, holding its secrets tightly, whispering them in frequencies only the metal could hear. The smell had returned, not strong, not overwhelming, but steady. A constant reminder. He reached the old industrial outskirts by noon, The abandoned lot where the salvage yard used to be had become a wasteland of concrete and weeds. Fences sagged inward, gates rusted ajar. A collapsed billboard leaned sideways over a dead patch of earth, its advertisement long since peeled to nothing. Daniel pulled the truck into the yard, wheels crunching over gravel and broken glass, and parked near what had once been a warehouse wall. Here, he would make the final decision. Here, the story would either end or be handed off to those who might carry it further. He stepped out and walked around to the back of the truck. The key turned reluctantly in the rusted lock, and the tailgate dropped with a groan. Empty. Of course. But that didn't matter anymore. The weight had never been physical. The truck had carried something else. Evidence, yes, but also memory. A history soaked into its very frame. The photographs, the names, the whisper in the metal that had drawn Ferguson and now him. They were part of a cycle, and Daniel no longer wished to be inside it. He opened the door and sat behind the wheel once more. The air was thick and stale. He reached down and pulled the lever that released the hood, then climbed out and walked to the front. The engine compartment looked unremarkable. Just an old block, wires worn and dirty, belts aging, the machine sagging from years of use. He leaned closer, tracing his fingers along the inner frame, to the crossbeam near the radiator. There, beneath a layer of grime and rust, he found what he'd come for. A panel. Welded, but not factory standard. He scraped at it with a screwdriver, careful, prying it up just enough to see beneath. A space. Small, reinforced, hollow. He wedged his flashlight in and looked closer. Inside were plastic wrappings, compressed documents sealed in vacuum-tight foil, and beneath them, a square object that at first glance resembled a black box flight recorder. Unmarked. Heavy. Silent. He stared at it for a long time. This was the core. The thing Ferguson had written about. The thing others had died to hide. It was never about blood in the carpet or a smell that wouldn't leave. It was always this. A hard drive, maybe, or some kind of archival unit built to survive. He reached for it, but stopped. Something told him it shouldn't be moved, not by him, not here. Instead, he sealed the panel again, left the hood unlatched, and backed away. A decision formed in him slowly, deeply. He would not destroy it. He would not keep it. He would bury it, yes, but not under concrete or in flames. He would give it a chance to be found by the right hands. Not now, maybe not soon, but someday. He returned home just after dusk, the truck abandoned behind him in a place he'd marked only with GPS coordinates saved offline. He had stripped it of plates, scraped off the remaining VINs, left no trace. By the time anyone found it, if anyone did, the elements would have claimed what little remained visible. But the core would still be there, quiet and waiting, like a heart suspended between beats. That night, Daniel made the final preparations. He uploaded the last of the files to Darren, who by now had gone underground, moving from safe house to safe house while building the case. The story had gained weight, and others had begun to take notice. Anonymous tips were coming in. Journalists, editors, archivists, people who recognized the pattern, who understood the language buried in manifests and fake company names. The outlines of something bigger were starting to appear. Daniel knew he couldn't be the center of it. Not anymore. His face was already on too many screens. His name had been whispered too often. The man in the black cap had already stood on his porch. That was enough. He packed a single duffel bag, no identification inside. Just cash, a cheap prepaid phone, and copies of the story carved into plain USB drives. He wrote a letter, short, careful, addressed to no one, but meant for anyone who might one day piece it all together. "The truth doesn't die," he wrote. "Not really. It sinks, it sleeps, but it waits, and when the time is right, it surfaces, just like metal in a field, just like a word scratched into steel." In the morning, he left the city, not running, not hiding, removing himself from the board. And back in the garage, where the truck had once stood, a faint outline remained. 4 oil-dark shapes on the floor, and against the wall, a piece of metal he had saved. A portion of the original driver's door, sanded down to bare steel. There, in shallow relief, the word still showed beneath the light, crude and distorted. "Help." A trace on metal. That was all that remained. And it was enough. If you want to uncover more shocking discoveries like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Watch the next video to see what happens when secrets from the past come back to life. And check out our other videos for even more unbelievable finds. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.